Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are today. Today's webinar is focusing on the emerging role of project management in drug discovery and supply chain. So something related to a lot of healthcare related domain over here. So let's get started here. There's a lot of information to cover. My name is Sriram Rajagopalan. For those of you that know me already, I'm working as an enterprise agile evangelist. I have a doctoral degree in organizational leadership and management, an MBA in management, Master of Science in computer engineering, and a bachelorate in electronics and communication. Started my career as a software engineer, moved along in the process and became a director and vice president managing program management office. I have had a lot of certifications under my credentials, personal agility, portfolio management, program management, project management, Scrum, Six Sigma, Lean, and many other things. I'm also an instructional designer, speaker, writer, and author. I have had facilitating experience in a number of different countries, some face-to-face and some virtually. So that's in a nutshell about me. So let's move. I also released a book called Organized Common Sense about how project management and agile principles apply regardless of the field of choice you have chosen to pursue. Today's webinar is again focusing on the role of project management in drug discovery and supply chain. And when I say this, the actual title of this role may be called differently depending upon the organization, the project delivery of choice, and many other considerations. But I'm just lumping them under the role of project management over here, but it spans across multiple domains as well. And we will get into that as we move forward. This is part of our thought leadership series. Sometimes I use some tool to introduce the concept. In this particular one, I may not be using any specific tool. So the role of project management, just to level set our foundation here in terms of how we are going to proceed. The drug discovery and development pipeline has a lot of things to it. And right from the time a specific compound is identified to the time it is actually approved for production by the federal government, is what is the main drug discovery process. But then the supply chain thought process come into play in terms of how we are producing this in mass scale and make sure that we are able to manufacture and distribute it to the appropriate retail chains and warehouse facilities, so that that whole process continues as well. So there is two parts to it, and I'm going to talk in terms of the management of science in the first place. What if we don't do this, and what are some of the challenges associated with that, and then the stages of discovery, and then move into the supply chain and try to integrate the concepts of project management related discipline throughout this presentation. That's how I'm planning to approach this presentation today. Okay. All right. First of all, I hope I am getting everybody's attention in terms of project manager in a scientific profession, because a lot of times the fields in the healthcare domain, particularly in the early stages of drug discovery, is very clinical and scientific in nature. So a number of people ask me, we want scientists, not necessarily managers. Because we don't want to necessarily yield to what the managers want us to do, but we really want us to do what the science wants us to do. And I want to make sure that we are answering this question very clearly, because if we approach science as a discipline, certain things have to be done in certain order, and there are repercussions if you don't do that. And that is the part that we are trying to push in terms of putting somebody who has that management oversight with the value proposition, the benefit identification, transition and sustenance model, and outcome-based research, And those are the things that we are trying to push for. We are not trying to say we need to have managers to manage science, but we need to have managers to manage how things are getting done as part of the scientific process itself. So I'm trying to push this thought process over here, and let's see what happens if we don't. Okay. What if we don't keep the end in mind, like the outcome, the benefits, the value, all those things that I talked about? Then we are talking about adverse effects, right? And uncontrolled signs in an unregulated market is a recipe for disaster. What do I mean by that? Uncontrolled signs and unregulated market. And today we are constantly thinking more and more about demand to market, the accelerated pace and faster time frame, reducing the cycle time, and many things that we are talking about. And if we don't control signs and don't have a proper regulated market, then that's going to cause a lot of challenges. It's a chaos. And we have seen this happen. History has already mentioned these things. Several years back, roughly about 5-6 decades back, there was a drug that was released called thalidomide. And primarily this was a drug used for morning sickness for pregnant women. And it reduced that morning sickness, and it was released without full controlled experiments and studies and evaluating what the outcomes of that was, and moved forward. And the result was that were a lot of children that were born, the babies were born without actual limbs. Instead, they had fissures, like the penguin kind of fissures. They had deformed arms and legs. That generation is just moving away right now, because we still have certain members of that generation still left. And thalidomide is an extremely important drug that set the ground for we need to control science and we need to regulate the market. And that was the fundamental reason behind a number of different drug acts that started coming in, like the FTCA, and a number of different things started coming in as a result of that. And so we need to keep this thing in mind. And today, when you see a lot of different drug advertisements in the different media channels, you see all those adverse effects immediately being called out for, because there's a lot of studies that are properly done to make sure that things are getting done the right way. Okay, so we need to make sure that science is a little bit more managed. We don't want to just do whatever we want, because otherwise we'll have a lot of Frankenstein kind of problems, right? So how are things getting done? So the stages of drug development, when you look at this, there's going to be first preclinical studies, where we are looking at some specific molecules and say whether this new chemical entity has a potential. And there also we get into small molecule, big molecule, micromolecule, macromolecule, and many other things. And so then we move into the next stage of clinical trials. Now that we are able to say that this chemical compound is a little bit stable, how can we move forward into the clinical style? And the clinical style also has multiple phases. We will get into those things later. And then the drug approval process, and then the post-approval assessment in terms of how it is performing in the market. Did we address the original problem that we said we will? We are planning to address, and what are the things that we are learning that we have to actually cycle back to the scientists, right? So each stage in this particular drug development process is loaded with a lot of uncertainty, and as project managers, uncertainty means risk, right? Experimentation still needs measurable objectives. So whenever you are looking into experimentation, you are looking at the hypothetical studies, stages of element that you want to evaluate for efficacy, toxicology, and many other things. And so these are all having some measurable objectives, because we want to make sure that we are progressing in the right direction. And there are cost considerations in every stage. At every point, you have to evaluate whether we should continue to move forward or whether we should actually, invest our time in something else. Management has to have, as a result, entry and exit criteria, right? And then different people have to be engaged at different phases of time and there are legal and regulatory implications for doing and not doing certain things. So there is a lot of things that you have to actually work with, and it's just not science alone, right? The results of science have to be documented, evaluated, reviewed by third-party providers and approved, and many other things are coming into play. So obviously, scientists need to do what they are meant to do in terms of science, but at the same time, there has to be other professions that come into play to help them, guide them, and move this whole process along, because we are all in this game together. Right? So the question is not about the need for project manager, but the question should be, what kind of competencies do we really need in a project manager? Or if we are going to put somebody as an ombudsman, what do we need in that particular person? Whether you call them project manager, product manager, scrum master, or whatever the project delivery of vehicle is, or approach that you are looking at, or maybe even a clinical research scientist with that management focus. It doesn't matter what that role is going to be called, but what are the competencies of project management that you want in that particular person to keep things flowing, right? The last thing we want to see happening is flow getting impacted. Let's take a look at this a little bit more further over here. So when you look at the drug development itself, there are several things that come into play. So first of all, the stakeholder groups. We're not just looking at one person or 10 persons. We are looking at a lot of groups, like the patient advisory group, the end users group, the physicians, the providers, pharmacologists, pharmacists, and regulatory people, legal people, medical. So there are so many different types of groups that we have to actually involve. And I'm still not talking about the demographics of the population we are studying. That goes into the management of the science itself, right? So there's a lot of people that needs to be involved, and you can involve everybody too early. You can involve people too late, and there needs to be a delicate balance of when do you involve people, right? And if you don't do this, it's going to be chaos, because a lot of people will try to provide a lot of different directions, and we will go nowhere. And the cost of getting a drug from inception to market is approximately 2.6 billion, with the B in boy. Excluding the cost of manufacturing at this point. And these are all different findings that are coming from different providers that provide this level of cost at this point, because there is cost to setting the manufacturing facilities for doing the work, and getting the work done, and the laboratories, and many other things that need to go with that, right? And there's a lot of cost involved over here. And at every point, we have to also start evaluating, should we continue to invest in this, or should we move to something else, right? And then the timeline, approximately it takes about 12 years, excluding how we are going to deliver the supply chain logistics, right? And that's a lot of time to invest. And we have to make sure that science can ensure safety, but also we are focusing on stability and sustainability, right? At the end of the day, if the material is not going to be stable and sustainable, we are not able to address the original problem that we started to address with, right? And risk, as I mentioned, everything has a lot of risk associated with this because of the complexities of potentially even death, right? And so efficacy has to be properly balanced with every one of those things. So you don't want to wrongly prescribe something, or a wrong dosage is prescribed, or things like that. So you have to look into a lot more additional things as part of the drug development consistently, right? So what's the roadmap looking like? Okay, when you look at the roadmap, the preclinical trial takes up to 4 years. And the whole idea of starting to identify the NCE, or the new chemical entity, is to actually go into first human dose. Like, are we able to identify the first human dose and then perform a testing? Right? And that is our readiness, right? That's our success criteria to move forward. And that's when we are coming up with the investigational new drug, which is often called IND submission, right? And as you try to move into the next phase, there's only about 12% of everything that we are identifying as chemical compounds that actually enter this stage of all those things. right? So 88% is getting dropped, only 12% is making it up. And out of those things, we are moving into the next phase of clinical trials on human population. The goal here is to make sure that there is a lot of pharmacological testing and toxicological testing done, so that there is no main, essential organs that are getting impacted, like heart, liver, brain, kidneys, and many of those things are getting impacted. And so that's our goal. As we move into that particular stage, we are getting into what is called an NDA or a BLA submission. NDA stands for New Drug Application, and BLA stands for Biologic License Application. And that takes another about 5 years. So by year 9, we are just getting ready for some major submissions of paperwork at this point to get approval, right? But approval is still not there. And then at this particular snapshot in time, we also have to start looking at additional things like, okay, what kind of efficacy, what kind of safety, effectiveness, risk are we actually doing? In fact, are we better off not giving this drug to the patients, or are we better off, right? So what kind of challenges that we are trying to come up with? So we need to look into all those elements, and about only 8 to 9% of the drugs that we entered the IND submission even get into this thing. So you can see the funnel, right? How it is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then another 3 years go by, and then the drug is getting approved by the FDA, the government, and then we are moving into the next phase of what kind of promotional materials we really have to create to educate the healthcare providers and the allied fields and the consumers and the providers, a lot of different things that we have to, do. So we have to have these end in mind as we are beginning the early stages itself, right? So there needs to be some strategic direction thought through right from the get-go, okay? Now, this is all the whole stages. Now, the person can come from different background. And so let's take a look at the product development here, from a business side of things, okay? So basic research, there needs to be a reasonable market research done on what is the number of people that are having this particular disease state or this particular challenge, what are the repercussions, what is the impact analysis, as a result of that, what product we can come up with, and what population of that particular universe that we are able to address, and a lot of additional things that needs to be factored in. As part of that, we are moving into the next stage, which is the clinical studies. So what kind of drugs can we actually develop? What would be the way in which that particular drug would interact within our human body? What challenges are we expecting? And what is a potential market strategy that we have to think through? And we are still in clinical studies, but we are already thinking through with the hope that this is going to move forward, right? We need to think through that. And then the regulatory approval process, what kind of labeling consideration we should really consider. And I'll get into a little bit more about labeling soon. And what kind of filing strategy we should have, and defining the launch plan for different types of people, and appropriately positioning the brand, and that would involve a number of other things itself, like the integration campaigns, the branded website and unbranded website, different placement ads, and printed materials and electronic materials. Lots of different things are all coming through, and all these things have to go through the regulatory approval, right? And so everything has to have a plan in mind. And then the product launch, as we are moving forward, which one of the materials that we originally thought is getting approved, which one is not moving forward, how do we make changes, and finalize our promotion and branding, and implement a launch campaign as a result of that. And after this launch is done, what are some of the learnings that we have actually heard, right? We need to look at the performance in terms of the adverse effects that may be reported, things that we have developed that are not necessarily responding well, and appropriately bring it back to different stages in this whole process to see how it should be adopted, right? Each and every one of these boxes that I have mentioned is almost like a small program. And within each and every one of those programs is supposed to be a lot of different product initiatives. And one scientist or a group of scientists alone is not necessarily going to address all these elements. So there is a lot more considerations that are involved over here, right? So let's take a look at how project management lifecycle may fit into this equation. And I'm trying to move away from this conventional approach of how you go about the initiation, planning, execution, monitoring, and control and closure. I'm looking at this in a little bit differently. An idea is getting initiated. Once the idea is getting initiated, how do you select the project based upon proper ROI criteria? Now tied back to the product management over here, like the value chain mapping. Right from there, what kind of people are required for different stages of our work to complete the work, right? And that skill assessment is coming into play. Right from there, what kind of kickoff do you need to have with different types of people? This is not simply just an IT project or simply a scientific project. Different types of members are getting involved, and so you need to look at this with a different thought process in mind, right? And as a result of that, how do you progressively plan? And this is very important because you cannot think like, okay, we are going to do Agile, and Agile doesn't fit into this approach. Progressive planning is part of the entire pharmaceutical process. And so you have to implement Agile approaches in your thought process as well, right? And as a result of that, two different things come up. How do you monitor and control repeatedly based upon feedback that's coming up? And how do you actually feed that back to your continuous improvement processes? Things may change right there in the work that you are doing or in the processes that you are actually following, right? As a result of that, you are focusing on operational excellence with a launch product in your mind. And then your health checks that you need to have at different points in time. As a result of these things, you need to come up with training for different types of members. And this continues until the product is actually going to be eliminated from the product. This is going to be a continuous cycle. And these four elements that I have circled here, the skill assessment, training, continuous improvement, and operational excellence, is constantly in progress, right? And so it's very critical for us to keep in mind that when we think of project, we don't think of operations, but this is going to be an elevated form of project management where you not only just focus on getting a product to the market, but also sustaining the product in the market, which is moving into program management and portfolio management with lots of sub-programs and sub-projects. And some of them could be following traditional approaches, some of them could be following agile approaches, some of them could be actually following basically a workflow management like Kanban or Lean. So different things come into play over here. Okay, so when you synthesize all these things about the project management role, then you come up with three important elements. First is going to be the preclinical stage, as I have mentioned before. In the preclinical stage, the project manager becomes more of a consultant, right? So scientists are playing a larger role, but then the project manager is putting on the consultative hat to actually think through the whole process and say, what are some of the compliance considerations we should have in mind? What are regulations we need to have in mind? So we need to have that thought process already starting right here, because the scientists may not necessarily think through that, because the scientists are focused on solving the problem through science, right? The project managers are focusing on getting this drug to the market and sustaining the drug into the market by looking at a number of other things into the play. So there is a different spin the project manager is putting, and scientists need that, right? Scientists appreciate that support. And the second one is going to be the clinical studies. In the clinical studies, different groups of members are getting involved. So as we are moving into the animal studies as well as into the human studies, different types of stakeholder groups are getting involved, and we need to constantly manage to the constraints at this point, the scope, schedule, and cost. And we also have to consistently monitor and respond to risks and address different types of communication with different types of people. So internal communication and external communication takes on a completely different value. Maybe you may be in charge of public relations. Maybe you are in charge of just dealing with the external auditors and medical, legal regulatory members. Maybe it's just scientists alone. So I don't know. So depending upon the scope, it may be completely different, right? And then the post-drug approval process, looking at email campaigns, monitoring, and a number of other things. So how do I integrate the campaigns for better performance? What kind of promotional materials are performing well that I need to revisit or get new materials reviewed and approved? How do I monitor for adverse events? And there are costs associated with each and every one of them. As doctors go and talk about this particular drug, there is spends and honoraria that needs to be tracked. It's part of Sunshine Act. And if you don't do that, there's going to be some bias that we are trying to introduce, where some doctors are prescribing certain drugs, even if it is not part of the labeling, right? So there's a lot of consideration that we need to keep in mind. And compliance confusion, I gave you a lot of different acronyms already, and there are still more acronyms coming here. We talked about IND and NDA, but there is also this MLR, medical legal regulatory team, promotional review committee, and promotions review team. So many other things are coming here. Most of these things are all based upon some of my previous experience. And so we have to understand the requirements of each one of those protocols or committees, and then accordingly prepare. Right, the people that you're going to be interfacing with is going to be multifaceted. Some are medical, some are legal, some are regulatory, right? So you have to prepare for these things, right? And so the consultative role is focusing on how do I structure the study, and how do I make sure that the discipline process is enforced, so that the data that we are having to say we did XYZ, as a result of that we got ABC, and this is what we are trying to solve, is really working out to our advantage. So we are looking at the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, the risk associated with it, which is called the REMS, and making sure that we are following all the generally accepted best practices that we have to follow, and involve appropriate level of stakeholders at this stage. Okay, so there is a lot of things that the consultative role brings here, even at this particular stage. Okay, now what is the project management role as we are moving into the next level? Okay, so at the next level, they are championing scopes towards the progress. So multiple different things are coming in, and as a result of multiple different initiatives, multiple different hypotheses, multiple different experiments happening at different points in time. So you are bringing all this to say, how do I connect them to the actual outcome that we are trying to do, and how do I plan for the risk and planning here? As you move into the next one, what are some of the factual decisions that you are looking at? So some concepts of statistical data analysis, not just the demographic, basic statistical analysis I'm looking at. I'm looking at some elements of factorial considerations, or things like linear regression, and a little bit more, so that you are able to come with some prescriptive and predictive analysis considerations here. And as a result of that, you are putting appropriate scope and schedule management here as well. Again, I have repeated this stakeholders repeatedly, and the stakeholders come into play as you are looking at this. You are looking at procurement, where would the raw materials for this chemical compounds come, and what kind of resources and contracting supplies I need to have. How do I collaborate with them? How do I train them? Number of different things are coming into play, because these are all actually manufactured and tested within a lab, right? And then as you are moving into the stage 2, we are now looking at multiple different phases. So particularly 3 different phases. The first phase is going to be finding some healthy volunteers who can test this. The second is going to be having some controlled experiment, where you are looking at small population samples and evaluating for appropriate clinical messaging. The third one is going to be a little bit more expanded version, where you have some test and control groups and evaluate whether things are working out correctly or not, and a larger population study over here. So as you are looking into each and every one of those stages, there is a little bit more additional thought process that needs to be involved here in terms of preparing for these studies, right? So some of the GXP processes, generally accepted process that we refer to, are all coming from the notion that the preclinical trials succeed only if the compound is checked against some of those important things, like the safety, toxicity, pharmacokinetics, and metabolism in humans, and things of that nature. And in order for us to do this, we have to rely on the scientists, and they will be talking a lot more about the mechanism of action and how it will work, and what are some of the things that we have to keep in mind. And these are critical. Even as a project manager, if that person does not necessarily understand these things, the importance of these things actually apply in terms of the materials you will develop and submit for PR. and have the team actually develop those things. So when you look at this, the GLP, the lab practices, generally accepted lab practices, come into play, where you are looking at uniformity, consistency of doing the work, reliability, reproducibility, quality, and integrity. In other words, if I replace the person and have the same experiment done by another person, everything should be of the same metrics. They should pass. Right. So those are some of the lab practices that we have to follow, starting from hygiene, who goes in, what they do, or how they do it, many other things, because each and every one of those things will have a lasting impact and have a lot of cost implications as well. Right. And then when you look at the manufacturing side, assuming that everything is getting approved and you're going to move into the post-drug processes where the supply chain comes up, and are you adhering to the protocols that are really required for you to manufacture them at large scale, and how do you ensure quality? So concepts of Six Sigma, lean, and all those things will start picking up right over here as well, in terms of how you ensure that the safety, sustainability, and integrity are maintained as a result of the GMP practices. And if you are able to produce a drug that you are not able to manufacture and distribute, then we have actually not solved the problem, right? And so it's very important that we need somebody who has that good balance of business acumen as well as detail orientation. That person is the project manager, who is supposed to be the ombudsman, removing the impediments, working with multiple groups, ensuring the process discipline is followed, and things of that nature. How you call them in different discipline, and how you call them in different companies in methodologies is different, right? But my focus here is that these concepts have to be thought through. And as you are looking at stage 2, you are moving into a larger project management capacity, where additional knowledges are coming in. So schedule, cost, resources, quality, scope, risk, and stakeholder, they're all coming in here. So they're taking a little bit more higher scope, because now you are entering into the stage 2, which means human lives are involved here. Whether it is animal studies or human studies, in both cases life is getting involved, and we can't take any chances. So it's very important here that we take risk too much into consideration here, right? So as we are moving into this, we have to consider some of the progressive elaboration thought process that I already mentioned. And what is the progressive elaboration thought process? In simple terms, going back to the Deming's analogy, we can say plan, do, check, act. That's going to be, you take something and then you move through this whole process. And the same process, but with a different context, applies in a drug discovery life cycle. And there we start with, okay, if there is an issue found out, or there is a challenge that you want to solve, and what is the rule or hypothesis that you are planning to do, how you are performing that analysis, and what are you concluding as a result of that. And this is the process that we go through. And when a regulator or a medical scientist come and say, hey, I found this and I have a challenge with this particular thought process that you have, and this is the approach that we actually follow or recommend that we follow. This is what clinical scientists are actually following in terms of how they resolve problems. Similar logic. So use different choice of words, but pretty much coming down to the similar process over here. So issue is what claim is in dispute. Rule is how rule, or how do we interpret this particular thing. Analysis, what the evidence do we have to actually support this or not support this, and what conclusions are we actually drawing as a result of our experiment, right? So the seeds of stage 3 success have to be sown right at the time of stage 2. You don't actually come into stage 3 and say, well, now that we have got it approved, what do we do next? Because if you start thinking at that particular point in time, you are thinking linearly in your mind, and that sequential process is not necessarily going to span out. So how do you actually set the stage 3 for success? Let's identify what is in stage 3 in the first place. Stage 3 is full of statutory laws, right? Some of the regulations, some of them we understand as the CFR regulations too. And what are some of the prior rulings that apply? In what some of the industry standards that we have to adhere to, whether it is GLP, GMP, or REMS, or whatever that is. And so what are some of our own companies' corporate policies that we have in place to ensure things are done the right way, right? So all these things have to be factored in as you move forward into avoiding unnecessary scope, or unclear scope, and setting the data properly with appropriate security provisions and things like that, so that you are able to do the proper data analysis, and also set up proper acceptance criteria to move forward with. And you are addressing any challenges with the risk. You are ensuring that safety claims are properly correlated. In other words, if you say XYZ applies in this particular scenario, you are not going to take that and apply it to a universal standard. In other words, I can't take a drug that applies for Caucasian, female population, 50 years and younger, and extend the same thing to, an Asian population and say you can use this, because now your claims are not necessarily properly correlated, right? And then avoid poor structure and presentation in terms of how you present the findings. In other words, if a healthcare provider or a doctor receives a communication about how a drug works, and how a consumer receives, a non-clinical person receives a pamphlet that talks about how this drug works, they have to tell the same story. Yes, the choice of the words will be different, but the story has to be the same. It can be a completely different story, right? How do we go about doing that? That's going to be setting the stage 3 for success as a result. You are coming up with lots of different materials, which comes up with prescribing information. That big pamphlet that you see in your document that contains a lot of details in 6 point, that's the prescribing information that has a lot of specific details, right? But it increases the formula, it produces a lot of technical terms in clinical setting and medical terminologies, and people may not necessarily understand that in a consumer setting, and you need to come up with what is called a medication guide. And the medication guide is more of a non-clinical language that a consumer can understand. It's those things that the pharmacists are using to actually explain to the consumers, whereas the prescribing information is the one that they and doctors use to understand how the actual things work, right? So there's a lot of things over here that we need to keep in mind here. As a result of that, certain things have to be focused on, because nobody is going to read this 6 point for a long period of time, right, with lots of details. So what are some of those important safety information? If you only have to review this 5 paragraphs or 3 pages, what are those important safety information? And from that, what are some of the selected safety information that sometimes may be applicable? And sometimes that could be black box warnings. Black box warnings are separate type of warnings that could potentially have somebody have fatal complications, right? So in that particular case, what is the thing that we have to actually adhere to? So things of that nature has to be kept in mind. So prescribing information, medication guide, as well as important safety and black box warning. Go ahead and look at different drugs, the companies, and you will see on their website the ISI, the SSI, black box, and many things as the drug warrants will be applicable. Okay, now success lies in prescribing. Okay, we got a drug, we got it approved, and we have all the materials prepared, and success lies in prescribing. Are the doctors prescribing what we are expecting them to do, right? And we can't directly tell the doctor to do certain things, because that's direct to consumers and that's not acceptable. And so what to develop? What kinds of materials do we actually develop for people to understand what this drug does and how it works? Right? What kind of binding responsibilities do we have? When you looked at this, what is involved in the promotion? And that may be just not talking about how the drug works and what it is, but maybe the physician, the consumers are looking for a voucher or a $10 coupon towards their copay or things like that. So what are some of those things that we have to develop but still be under the governing regulations? What are those governing regulations? Those regulations may take a different tone based upon the drug, based upon how it is actually used. A surgical implant has a different connotation, regulations, compared to a drug that you have to just take orally, right? As a result of that, what binding responsibilities? How do you recruit, send the information about recruitment? How do you send information about fulfillment? Like if I take this drug and I do this for 3 months, I'm going to get a $10 copay. How do I get the $10 copay to them? Spend reporting, if the doctors are talking about this, any adverse event reporting, who does, what was the symptom, when was it reported, and many of those things, including as simple as a rash that you develop has to be reported, right? And as a result of these things that you are considering, too many other factors come into play. Look at this annotated sales aid. The sales aid have to be annotated from which particular reference was used to say you did this, which means you have to go back to the exact study. So you need to have proper data on file. And the slide decks that you are developing, each and every one of those slide decks have to have proper connotation and references according to the reference format that you need. Your websites have to actually provide that information, so you have to have a proper fair balance. You can say things that are not necessarily accurate. Where do you place the journal ads, and what kind of materials do you actually create for conventions where you don't have the luxury of putting those big ISI and things like that, because the real estate doesn't allow that. When do you use existing reprinted materials that you already have? What other material that you should develop? Many other things come into play, because not all doctors are going to be digitally savvy. Some of them have to be on print, some of them have to be on different materials, some of them have to be with different animations included and things like that, which are e-detail, m-detail, and things of that nature. Now, I haven't talked about branding guidelines. The color, the font, the emphasis, many things that are as part of the branding guidelines. I haven't even talked about these things. Now, so as you can see, there is a lot more involved in terms of pulling this whole thing through, right? So now, how do you scale all these things for production? Now, when you look at this for production capacity, you are looking at creating these things in the laboratory environment, and now you need to be able to produce them in a mass scale. And now things don't just go from 0 to 60 seconds very fast, right? You have to actually make sure that when the drug is actually produced, you are incrementally looking at how do I ensure that I can produce this in a higher capacity, in a larger quantity, and still ensure that all properties of the drug that I developed in a smaller capacity is still maintained. And you have to constantly do this as part of the whole thing. So you started with a why, you actually identified the viral properties of this, and then you are evaluating the host validity, and now you are looking at the strength. Like, how do I generate this so that as I increase the capacity of production, it's not losing its original strength, right? And that element goes into a lot more additional things in your stage 2 and stage 3 side itself. The scientists will be looking at, okay, I tried this in a smaller capacity in a bioreactor, it worked fine. Now I'm moving into a larger device, where I'm generating more volume and then more volume. And so as they are moving from the spinner flasks and tubes and microplates, they are looking at how I am able to constantly generate. So they have to come up with some ideas in terms of, if you are going to produce this in a larger capacity, what are the things that you have to keep in mind? So maybe I give you a concentrated dose, and you have to titrate it or dilute it, so that you are able to produce the appropriate volume for the dosage. So how do I move forward in those considerations? So you have to think production much in advance before you move forward. And these things are all looked at by approval processes before you move forward, and different processes kick in at different points in time. So when you look at supply chain, there are two important things that I want to call out. This itself can be a separate large topic for discussion. And now when you look at this primary manufacturing and secondary manufacturing, right? When you look at the primary manufacturing, you already started with the actual compound, right? The new chemical entity. Now, that particular drug may not be handled by all manufacturing facilities. Certain facilities can handle certain types of, high-end, higher risk compounds, right? But not everybody can handle them. So some contracting facilities that can actually deal with the active ingredient, and I'm not talking artificial intelligence here. It's about the active ingredient that is part of your specific drug, who can manufacture that, in appropriately putting some contracts in place so that you are able to follow the protocols and train the people, make sure that you have the recordings of all the training completed, records of all the training completed, and also go through the checks and balances in terms of who should not work in your program, because some people will be barred from working in certain types of programs and things like that. um, um, and then what are some of the stages in which you have to move forward with that particular things, how much capacity they can handle of the inventory, what kind of downstream quality checks and balances that they have to have. Sometimes the chemical compound may be developed in multiple stages. So for instance, I had to give you this compound and you had to move from point 1 to point 2, or point A to point B, and point B to point C, and then only the compound is ready for subsequent downstream work. In that particular case, what are the checks and balances that you have from each one of those stages? So there needs to be some proper quality handling procedures and things like that. And as you hand it off to other members, or you are looking at incoming materials, what are some of the third-party level controls that you need to have? The human resources for adherence and compliance that I talked about. So these things have to be kept in mind as part of the primary manufacturing facilities. And as you are moving into the secondary, which means these are members that are not actually dealing with the manufacturing of the primary drug, but they are actually using it for other things, like maybe they want to put some color coating on it to make sure that different population can consume it, and then maybe some kind of chemical to make it easily palatable for them, or maybe even just packaging of those things, how they are getting packaged. Main thing is they are not primarily involved in developing in handling that active ingredient, but they are focusing on a lot more things about how to package them, how to transport them, and things of that nature. And we are talking about COVID at this point, where we have been discussing about certain drugs that needs to have certain temperature control during their transportation. And these are the things that we are talking about: the humidity, the temperature control, all these things that needs to be in place when the drug is actually getting transported through trucks or whatever vehicle of choice, that it doesn't lose its efficacy. And purpose for which it was intended for. So those are some of the things that we are keeping in mind. And now the thought process may be completely handled by a different project manager, or could be handed off by one project manager to another project manager. And so there are thoughts that need to come in place in terms of proper documentations and controls as we are moving forward. Okay. Now, as I'm trying to bring some summary into these things, we talked about the consulting role that the project manager plays in the clinical stage 1, right? That probably is the smallest project management footprint. But as you are moving into the second stage of clinical studies, whether you are involving animal studies or human studies, for both of them, these additional things come into play. But the extent of stakeholders that you are going to manage is going to be different. But you still are actually managing risks and communications with all these different stakeholders. And as you are moving into the stage 3, getting ready for approvals and making sure that the practices are ready for you to manufacture and things like that, you are looking at lots of additional other things in terms of manufacturing, promotional campaigns, getting materials ready for promotions for different types of target audience. Some of them could be clinicians, some of them could be non-clinical consumers, and looking at other acts that you really have to keep in mind as you are trying to move through this whole process. Okay, so in summary, drug discovery is about reducing the timeline for the drug that you are actually trying to develop to solve the problem, and how you can facilitate that, and how can you ensure that improved benefit management is constantly present as a result of your drug that is getting developed, and enhanced risk management during the time the drug is getting developed, but also after the drug is in the market, and also while the drug is getting actually manufactured, to ensure that people that are involved in the process are properly protected too. and then better stakeholder engagement as a result of the different groups of people of different caliber are expected to interface in this drug discovery life cycle. And as you move into the supply chain, and there is proper handoff, and right from that handoff, you are looking at how do I make sure that there is proper demand, and how do I manage the demand with inventory management, with incoming materials and outgoing materials, and production planning and resource planning as well, with many things that I talked about. So that brings a closure to the topic that I wanted to talk about. This is a very large topic to pick and choose. At the same time, I have picked some of the main threads and focused on that particular section alone, rather than going in depth into any one particular section. If you have any specific thoughts, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We look forward to hearing your feedback. And thank you very much for your time at this point.